Truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Friday, October 11th, 2024, the 1,360th day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you'll be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the free version on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin, and you feel better about precious metals. I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company, and that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so yesterday we were talking about the potential for a smooth transition to a second Trump administration, especially in light of CNN publishing an article describing how the Trump team had not been in contact with the proper governmental authorities in order to arrange a smooth transition in the event that they might win. this very, very close race. The various members and agencies of the entrenched deep state bureaucracy, the administrative state, were wondering why Donald Trump and his team did not want to hear from them and read their memos about their plans for how they would be planning to transition from communists into non-communists in order to work with the Trump administration and make themselves valuable and important to the Trump administration, retain their roles that they have always had in every prior administration and would need to continue to have if the government in its current form is going to persist into the future. It's one thing to lose the presidency or the House or the Senate. It's another thing to lose the entrenched deep state bureaucracy, the administrative state. They've worked so long to build that. And in fact, it's that administrative state that actually runs everything, because clearly the fake President Joe Biden and the fake Vice President Kamala Harris aren't actually exercising any influence on guiding the country. They're little more than the paid celebrity spokespeople we used to see on daytime television selling life insurance and various gadgets that you definitely need and that they can convince Medicare to pay for. Now, of course, the administrative state hates Trump and they're scared of Trump. Imagine, for instance, if one of these regulatory bodies like the FDA or the EPA was the gravy train for all the major companies in that industry, and those companies would profit greatly if only they went along with the totality of the regime agenda. The regime would help them stomp out their competition so long as they continued to comply. That's essentially a cartel, and that's essentially what we have. So what would it mean then if the Environmental Protection Agency just ceased to exist? Now, if you're a child-brained standard issue villager on the uniparty left, that means that the world is going to be destroyed in 30 years because the thing called the Environmental Protection Agency is no longer around. And we wouldn't even have a planet right now if the Environmental Protection Agency hadn't been around 1,000 years ago. So I guess they kind of have a point. But for anyone with a functioning brain, the termination of a federal agency with a nice sounding name cannot possibly destroy all of God's creation. And of course, that's not why they're protecting it. But what about all those companies that are able to stomp out their competition based on their willingness to comply with the global regime agenda? They're happy to do the dirty work because they get all the treats and they grow so large that no one could ever replace them. That situation stays in place because the federal agencies continue to exist. What if someone like Donald Trump were to come in and just begin getting rid of them? Now, it's worth noting that most of these agencies took it upon themselves on behalf of the regime and their corporate partners and sometimes sponsors, and they subverted the first Trump administration. But I imagine they were a lot more confident 8 years ago than they are right now. So right now, you would have to imagine that whatever transition documents they might be creating and willing to pass along would probably be essentially sales pitches on why they need to stick around to manage these systems in a way that will prove marginally acceptable for a few years until they can begin their subversion again in preparation for a return to a regime candidate, a uniparty candidate, to once again be the face of that uniparty regime government that is essentially just a foreign occupation. Donald Trump wasn't all that interested in reading their thoughts, apparently, because we're hearing that there has been no contact. And the truth is there doesn't need to be contact because the government that we are shown on television as being in place in this country is illegitimate. They are nothing more than the public-facing representatives of that deep, bureaucratic, administrative state that operate whatever agencies still remain and whatever functions remain under their purview. They operate essentially as some kind of shadow iteration of a government structure that is collapsing and disappearing before our eyes. I've seen people theorizing that perhaps all of this is because the Trump team doesn't want to tip their hand on who might serve in the next Trump term, and maybe there's some truth to that. But I think it might just be because none of this is actually necessary. We talked about the International Crisis Group report yesterday and how they recognized in that report from March 2020 that since January of 2019, there had been 2 presidencies in Venezuela. They were attempting to remove Nicolas Maduro by scheduling elections earlier. They wanted to change the composition of the election governing bodies, and they wanted to apply any influence necessary to get Maduro to step down so they could take over in Venezuela. But they recognized 2 presidencies because the guy in there was not their guy. So they had to tell the rest of the world, you know what? This is actually the president in Venezuela. And if you are part of our contingent and our coalition worldwide, if you are part of this liberal international rules-based order, then you need to do business with that guy because we are going to sanction the absolute shit out of Maduro and Venezuela and try to economically destroy that country so that the people of that country will rise up and remove Maduro from power simply to ease their economic suffering. When their guy is in power, there is only one president, and that president must be recognized by absolutely everyone, or else you're threatening to destroy our democracy worldwide. But if it's not the regime's guy in power, then there's 2 presidents. And they use this program all across the world over and over again. In Venezuela's situation in particular, Maduro was opposed by a man named Edmundo Urrutia Gonzalez. And if they were somehow able to shoehorn him into office, he would have soon been replaced by a young woman named Maria Corina Machado. What does that sound like? Well, it sounds like Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. The corrupt old man is just a Trojan horse to bring in this young, vibrant communist woman that everyone just wants to have a cackle with. They attempt different versions of this program everywhere, and they've been doing it for as long as they've been taking over countries. All you need is full economic control and full media propaganda control, and whoever they want becomes president everywhere. And they had that, at least through what we call the Western world, which is essentially just the British Commonwealth, a handful of European nations, and their colonies worldwide. And oh yeah, of course, Israel. Puppet government after puppet government after puppet government. All of their action influenced and directed by global governing bodies. All of that influenced and directed on behalf of global bankers and whatever other shadowy interests have been promoting this agenda for centuries or millennia. And so I believe that we can think of our situation with this government in very much the same way that I described the relationship between reality prime and the false reality. We have that reality prime base layer, this empirical, observable reality that we interact with on a direct physical level. And then we have layer upon layer of the false reality created on top of that through various social constructs, through the entertainment we consume, various narratives that have built over time, false histories we've been taught are real. All of these things create our perception of the world, and that layers on top of reality prime. And the more we interact with those perceptive elements that aren't true, they exist only in that false reality layer, the more we interact with those, the more actions we take in reality prime under the belief that we are actually interfacing with those elements of the false reality. We are simultaneously changing elements of reality prime in a way that's in complete opposition to what we think we're doing while suffering under a total inversion in that false reality layer. And here's an example. I hope it doesn't hit home for too many people in a sad or depressing way, but I understand that it might. Nonetheless, it's a good example. There are a lot of people out there who were told they were going to lose their jobs unless they went out and got a COVID shot. They went along with the vaccine mandate. They went out and got that shot. And they said to themselves, I have a family that I need to protect, and my family depends on this income. If I refuse to go out and get this COVID shot, then I'm going to be fired from my job, and my wife and kids, they're going to go hungry. And that makes a lot of sense in the false reality. because we're led to believe that money is the absolute most important thing, even if it means we're not around anymore. People risked their lives. They injected themselves with a toxic experimental substance that could not protect them from a disease that could not kill them. The COVID shot itself was already a product of inversion within the false reality. The science said to do something that had never been done so that we could save ourselves from a disease that wasn't deadly by injecting ourselves with something that could kill us. The science said that. And then people injected themselves with that substance to keep their jobs so they could keep making money to take care of their family, but risked the possibility that the substance they were injecting themselves with could actually kill them at any point. And then there would not only be no money for the family in the future if you're dead, there would be no time. There would be no love. There would be no guidance. It wasn't just that you would have to raise your children in a significantly diminished material state for some time until you made the money again. It was that people simply wouldn't be around. And I would argue that's because people weren't thinking on that base layer. They weren't interfacing with reality prime. They were operating in correspondence with the incentive and punishment structure within that false reality, and potentially also within the party of false decorum. And I'm differentiating because the incentive and punishment structure in the party of false decorum is not the only incentive and punishment structure within the false reality layers. And so how do we apply that to the way that we are viewing our so-called government and the situation that we find ourselves in? Now, we had a founding of this nation. There's certainly founding mythology. That mythology certainly does not reflect the reality, but it probably reflects aspects of that reality and gives us at least a set of principles to aspire to. And regardless of whether or not that founding mythology is reflected in the reality 250 years later, that founding mythology is still our birthright. That is the thing that we were promised. And in many ways, that's more important. But to the extent that we have a government and to the extent that government could be legitimate, it is that layer at which that legitimacy could be realized. And on top of that layer, there's a whole lot of nonsense. We have talked many times and at length about Columbia Law School professor George P. Fletcher's book, Our Secret Constitution. In that book, Fletcher makes the argument that Abraham Lincoln and the Union fought the Civil War so that they could replace the Constitution with a second Constitution. And he makes the argument that that second Constitution is layered on top of the original Constitution. But that second Constitution inverts the meaning and intent of the original Constitution. We change from a republic into a democracy. We replace liberty and freedom with some notion of equality. And we replace the focus on the rights of the individual with the good of the state. This is not my interpretation. Fletcher is explicit about this. He thinks that Abraham Lincoln is a great hero for ushering in this new Constitution and the Reconstruction Amendments that inverted the meaning of our original Constitution and set us on the proper path. We can see the results across the board, but the truth is that wasn't even the beginning of this process. The Anti-Federalists warned about problems with the Constitution and how it was written. They believed that it was a concession to the very people they had just defeated. And now, 250 years later, we can see that their arguments were correct and things fell apart in the ways they suggested. Our power and control was systematically shifted back to the same global regime from which our founding mythology says we extricated ourselves. Now, the Supreme Court in the last few years has been undoing some of this, and all of that's good, and maybe that's the solution. Maybe we get back to the original Constitution and its meaning and its protections through this stepwise process that removes those layers of falsehood, and I'm totally open to that process. But until that process is completed, we need to recognize those layers of falsity. most of the rules and regulations we live by, the statutes under which we can be promised, the court precedents that have inverted the meanings of laws that allow all of this unconstitutionality and anti-constitutionality to persist, that stuff needs to go away. But the truth is, right now, we don't have to allow it to govern us in the first place. Anything the state does beyond that is an overt use of state violence and a violation of human rights, even according to their own standards. But of course, we refuse to recognize it. Now, let's just say, for instance, if the global regime is competing in some sense with the people of the world in any individual nation that you might bring up, there is a sovereign faction, a nationalist faction in that nation that does not want to be part of the global regime system, then we could see the effort of the global regime in all of these countries around the world to seize full and complete control to the extent to which they are able to suppress opposition and resistance from those sovereign nationalist factions. And this is what I describe as the global good twin versus the global evil twin. So you've got this same struggle everywhere, this push and pull. The global evil twin is the global regime with these global governing bodies, the global bankers. They influence the countries around the world. They bring them under control through a cycle of these color revolutions, societal destabilizations, and infiltrations. The agenda is then implemented. Over time, people will get upset and reject that agenda, and the process repeats itself. Their weapons are, first and foremost, the propaganda media, waging narrative influence campaigns. You can imagine this at a very small level, by the way. If your neighbor is trying to take over running the HOA, they might create a rumor campaign in your neighborhood or building. If that doesn't work, they might try to wield financial influence. And I don't know how crazy HOAs get about this stuff, but after that point, there would be more direct action. But on the nation state level, they create the controlled opposition dynamic and then use that and the propaganda media to reject anyone who threatens the underlying truth of those controlled opposition dynamics. They will destroy people's reputations. They will attack their character. They will accuse people of things they didn't do. On a society-wide scale, they accuse people of atrocities. We watched white police officers be accused collectively in hunting black men in the United States of America just a few years ago. Or, for example, just a couple of years ago, we regularly heard about Russia committing various war crimes, like bombing children's hospitals, and we were shown psyops to convince us that was true. The goal is to change public sentiment so that the people themselves will enact the agenda. They will replace the bad people. They will be the resistance all by themselves, and not another finger needs to be lifted. If that doesn't work, then you go to the economic level. You buy people off. You sanction others. You can sanction entire companies. You can sanction entire countries. You can wage economic warfare for as long as necessary if you are the regime and you have access to the regime's fiat currency, currently branded as the American dollar. And if all of that fails too, well, then you can just wage war. That's what UN peacekeeping missions do. That's what NATO exists for. And often, sadly, that is what our U.S. military has been historically used for. Our country essentially funds and protects that global regime. And of course, that arrangement exists because the global regime maintains power over the global media, global finance, and Team America World Police. But what would happen if they just didn't have those tools anymore? If the global propaganda media didn't work like it used to and people could bypass it? If, let's say, countries representing more than half the world's population, including and especially people who had been most harmed by the implementation of the global regime's agenda, were to just move beyond that regime fiat currency and create their own currency so they could trade with one another outside of that system, well, that enforcement mechanism would disappear. And then all you've got left is Team America World Police and NATO and the UN peacekeeping missions. But here's the thing. The UN peacekeeping missions were basically mercenary forces from the global regime factions in all of the countries they were trying to take over. And that element has kind of been lost too. Their program cannot be run without control of the media, control of the finance, and control of the force mechanisms. We can see the so-called Biden-Harris administration attempting to use all of these mechanisms to suppress their opposition and suppress their resistance, bring everyone into compliance, bring everyone into line. We see Kamala Harris going out on major television shows. She goes and sees Oprah. She goes and sees Howard Stern. She goes and sees Stephen Colbert. There's an entire segment of the country that will never watch any of those people again. They are legacy entertainment because they are part of that legacy system, that legacy media the global regime controls. But they can't get their message out that way, and no one believes it. So that part of their system, their control mechanism, is breaking down. The same thing is true of the finance. Part of this is the rise of BRICS. Part of it is the advent of Bitcoin and potentially other cryptocurrencies, I guess. Perhaps decentralized finance in general. And they really don't seem to have control of the military. If they did, they would probably be sending them around the world to protect these proxy states they are losing, proxy states that are being reclaimed by the sovereign nationalist leaders of these other countries around the world who want nothing to do with the global regime. And so ultimately, we have to think of this on a sliding scale. How much infiltration and control does the global regime have? And separately, what is the people's perception of that underlying reality? And to what degree is their perception influenced by that legacy media propaganda operation? Think about this. What if it was true that only 5% of the country actually believed that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were in power? Would they be able to exercise power in this country if the people said, yeah, we're not going to comply with any of this? We're not going to recognize the government. We're not interested in violence. We're not trying to overthrow the country violently. We're not trying to overthrow our state governments violently. We just simply don't recognize them anymore because they are illegitimate and they need us to go along with their systems in order for them to have their systems. If only 5% of the people were still going along with that and 95% of the people attested to the legitimacy of Donald Trump as the president, as the leader of government, they wouldn't have any power whatsoever, regardless of how much actual power they have right now. They might still control elements of our judicial system. They might still have federal agencies in place that regulate your business or your industry. I'm not suggesting that all of it is gone in reality yet. I'm just suggesting that that's not the only layer that matters. That layer matters to the extent to which people give that layer credence and legitimacy through their collective belief. Without proper enforcement mechanisms and the ability to enforce their agenda by visibly and publicly suppressing dissent, those layers will disappear the moment they are recognized and challenged, because they do not comport to the reality prime layer of our government, which is that founding mythology and the Constitution in its original form and intent. That is where we are being brought through this process. And if that is where we want to go, then we need to recognize it and propel ourselves forward in that direction by not only refusing to comply with those layers of falsehood, but by calling them false and pointing out they're false at every possible occasion, rather than reaffirming their legitimacy because you have some sort of nostalgic affinity for our institutions. These institutions are not what they were intended to be. I'm down to join you in your nostalgia for our institutions if those institutions were what they were intended to be. It cannot ever be radical to suggest that everyone comply with the set of rules we all actually agreed to. And it cannot be radical to point out, hey, that's not in the set of rules we actually agreed to. I don't have to go along with that. And it doesn't matter if the rule has only been violated for 2 years, or if it's been violated for 50 years, or if it's been violated for 250 years. It's not radical to say that's not the rule that anyone agreed to. That is a distortion of the rule. That is a distortion of our Constitution. That is a distortion of our system, of our morality, of everything we intend ourselves to be. That is a distortion. It is not radical to demand to be returned to that. It is not a violation of our conservatism to want to reverse those distortions. But the influences of controlled opposition suggest otherwise. It would be akin to arguing that we can't get rid of transition gender surgeries for kids because they're in place now. And what are you, some kind of radical? If you were conservative, you wouldn't want to threaten the system in that way. It's absolutely crazy, but that's what we deal with. We were told that we couldn't call out the obvious, blatant, in broad daylight rigging and theft of what we are told were the elections through which we determine our leaders and representatives, because it would threaten our institutions, because it would threaten our very democracy. And we as conservatives, we don't want to upset the apple cart like that. Things aren't great, but they're okay. And they could get a lot worse if something goes wrong. So, we're going to grovel for now. And hopefully we can win a number of rigged and stolen elections in a row. It would probably take 30 or 40 or 50 years to win enough to gain back the sort of power that we need. And of course, it's not actually possible to win any rigged and stolen elections. But it's not conservative to threaten to remove some of our institutions. I mean, these totally corrupted and illegitimate man-made organizations are what our country is founded on. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you do sound like a very principled conservative. I get it. The point is that ultimately it comes down to what we are willing to go along with, what we are prepared to believe. The system survives because we keep breathing life into it. When the report from the International Crisis Group says there were 2 presidencies in Venezuela, they mean there's the sovereign nationalist president and there's their guy that they recognize that all the other countries of the global regime, or countries that want to remain on the global regime's good side, do business with. They used to be able to enforce that. They can't enforce it anymore. So let's flash back to January 4th, 2023. This is Axios. The headline: U.S. no longer recognizes Guaido as Venezuela's president. Biden official confirms. The U.S. is following the lead of Venezuela's opposition lawmakers and no longer considering Juan Guaido as the country's legitimate leader after the opposition-controlled National Assembly voted to dissolve the interim government, a senior U.S. State Department official confirmed to Axios on Wednesday. Okay? So the U.S., in one moment, ceased to recognize Guaido as the president, and that's all it took. The regime-controlled National Assembly decided to dissolve their shadow government in what you can be sure was some concession along the negotiating lines described in that International Crisis Group report. And at that moment, Guaido was no longer the president in the eyes of the regime, which doesn't matter because Nicolas Maduro was the president the entire time. There just weren't 2 presidencies anymore. Let's continue. Guaido never truly held the levers of power in Caracas. And his support with the public and within the fractured opposition had been slipping for years. But U.S. policy and, crucially, the opposition's claim to billions in Venezuelan assets overseas were still based around the premise of Guaido's legitimacy. So U.S. policy in Venezuela was based on Juan Guaido actually being president when he wasn't president and didn't hold any power. Juan Guaido was a fake president of Venezuela, simply recognized as the guy these other countries need to do business with. And they just told you why they stopped recognizing him as the fake president. It's because the opposition, that's the regime, by the way, the regime sets up, quote unquote, the opposition in any country controlled by sovereign nationalists, needed to get back its billions of dollars in Venezuelan assets held overseas. The U.S. stopped recognizing Guaido so various regime figures and entities could get their money back. And I want to read this sentence again. Focus in on the very end of it. U.S. policy and, crucially, the opposition's claim to billions in Venezuelan assets overseas were still based around the premise of Guaido's legitimacy. Of course, there was no premise for Guaido's legitimacy. They just said that because that's what they do. That's all a president being legitimate to them consists of. This is who we decided to make president. And they're able to do that in our government, too, to the extent it can be enforced through media manipulation, financial manipulation, and at the end of all of that, force. You will remember that they consistently disavowed any premise of Trump's legitimacy. And in their minds, that's real because Trump's not running, quote unquote, our democracy. Trump is running our constitutional republic. Opposition lawmakers voted 72-29 on Friday to pull the plug on the quote unquote interim presidency. 4 years after the Trump administration and dozens of other countries had backed Guaido's bid to displace Nicolas Maduro. Dozens of other countries. It's weird, isn't it, that they can't prove the people of Venezuela backed Guaido? Guaido's allies warned that the move would compromise the opposition's international legitimacy and risk the overseas assets falling into Maduro's hands. And I guess that argument did not win the day. Not that they weren't correct. There is no international premise of legitimacy for Guaido's government. And to believe that the sovereign nationalist nations and leaders around the world, like Mohammed bin Salman or Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping, ever recognized any legitimacy whatsoever to Juan Guaido's quote-unquote presidency is preposterous. We are not in a different situation here. We are in the same situation. Let's continue with this article. Axios articles are never all that long. But others in the opposition noted that Guaido's government had failed to produce democratic elections and was never intended to be permanent. Well, how's it going to produce, quote unquote, democratic elections? It's not even a real government, and they had a real president the entire time. The step put the U.S. in an awkward position. While the Biden administration has softened its approach to Maduro and promoted dialogue with the regime, it had continued to treat Guaido as its primary interlocutor, even as governments in Europe and Latin America stopped recognizing him. They just called Guaido the primary interlocutor. What does that mean? That means that's the guy regime-oriented nations do business with. And they admit that governments in Europe and Latin America stopped recognizing him. Isn't that amazing? You can become not president anymore just based on people failing to recognize you as president? How is it even possible? After the vote, spokespeople for the White House and State Department declined to say whether the U.S. was dropping its recognition of Guaido. Instead, they said the U.S. recognized the National Assembly, elected in 2015, which Guaido had led as Venezuela's only remaining democratically elected institution. So the body that the regime controls, that was elected 8 years ago, that's the only legitimate body recognized by the regime, and Guaido led it. Wow, that's amazing. Also, we're told that this is the result of a vote in the National Assembly, the only regime-recognized body that led to the U.S. no longer recognizing Guaido. But that wasn't required for the governments in Latin America and Europe. And of course, it wasn't required for any of those sovereign nationalist governments that never recognized him in the first place because Venezuela already had a president? Should we imagine that the global propaganda media was telling the people in their colonies that Nicolas Maduro was actually the real president? We just have this guy Guaido over there we do business with. Juan Guaido is like Tony Soprano's girlfriend. He's got a wife. Everybody knows his wife. He's not even trying to get divorced. He loves his wife. Just also has a girlfriend. Maybe even a bunch of girlfriends. However, senior State Department officials told Axios on Wednesday the 2015 National Assembly recognizes Guaido as one of its members, not as interim president, as the interim government no longer exists. So we're following their lead. But here's the thing. It was never an interim government. It was never any kind of government whatsoever. It was a body that wielded certain influence, illegitimate in that country, but recognized by other people around the world. And the extent to which they could wield influence and power was the extent to which they could claim any sort of legitimacy. All of it existed on the false reality layer because there was already a real president who controlled the real elements and was supported by the military. There was no constitutional process by which Guaido, quote unquote, left office. Everyone simply stopped recognizing him as any kind of president. The official went on. The National Assembly is currently in the midst of making internal decisions regarding its own leadership, so we're going to wait and see how that plays out. The U.S. will continue to communicate with Guaido and other, quote unquote, like-minded members of the opposition, the official added. Guaido's presidency became a self-perpetuating thesis, said Phil Gunson, an international crisis group analyst in Caracas. Oh, fantastic. His mission to quickly replace Maduro had failed. He'd lost public confidence, and he lacked the support of 3 of the 4 major opposition factions, but his international backing and control of some government assets seemed to make him immovable, Gunson told Axios. Finally, though, opposition lawmakers decided to, quote, chop off the afflicted limb, end quote, and accept the, quote unquote, painful consequences, Gunson said, adding that it remains to be seen whether the dissolution of the interim government will have any bearing on court cases regarding gold reserves held in the UK or control of oil refiner Citgo. Sounds like the International Crisis Group and their partner organizations at Shell and BP and Chevron didn't win that play in Venezuela. How very sad. What's next? The National Assembly, which convenes over Zoom because much of the opposition is now in exile, is expected to select its new leadership this week. While Guaido derived his claim to the presidency on the assembly leader's place in the presidential line of succession, that model has now been scrapped. So you see that? He never won an election. Guaido never even ran for president. He was just the leader of the regime-controlled National Assembly, and Donald Trump announced to the world that the United States now recognizes him as the real president. This is another one of those instances where the thing Donald Trump says and claims to support is not always Donald Trump just telling you what he actually wants, what the right move is, or what you should believe. Recognizing Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela was a chess move. It was almost definitely the result of a negotiation. Some concessions were made to get Donald Trump to announce that he recognized Guaido. He not only recognized him, he brought Guaido to the United States and honored him at the State of the Union speech. This would be akin to countries around the world simply recognizing Nancy Pelosi as the president because of her position in the line of succession back in 2020 through, I guess, January of 2023. But we don't need to go down that path. There's only conspiracy theories down there. Let's close out this article. The opposition remains divided and appears unlikely to rally around one single figure in the near term. There may be no clear opposition leader until candidates are selected for the presidential elections planned for 2024, blah, blah, blah. We all know how that turned out. The talks between Maduro and representatives of the opposition are likely to continue, but Maduro has thus far, quote, shown no willingness at any point to grant the kinds of concessions that might lead to free and fair elections, Gunson says. And those concessions were outlined in that report. Free and fair elections are, in Gunson's own words, a self-perpetuating thesis based on the premise of legitimacy according to the global regime, as represented here and often by the International Crisis Group, chaired by Lord Mark Malloch Brown, with Alexander Soros and George Soros on their board of trustees, with Robert Malley as their president and CEO. Robert Malley is the fake and illegitimate Biden administration's top diplomat for Iran and was implicated in a scandal involving the mishandling of classified information. Isn't that what Jack Smith was going after Donald Trump for? Ask yourself this. Did Nicolas Maduro need to go through a transition process to resume his presidency of Venezuela when regime-oriented governments around the world stopped recognizing Juan Guaido as president, even though Juan Guaido never exercised any power in the first place? No transition was necessary. And I can prove that because no transition took place. And Nicolas Maduro just kept chugging right along being president. And it's funny because most of regime media will say that Maduro's been president for years. They can call other people president of Venezuela as many times as they want. It doesn't change the fact that Nicolas Maduro has been president of Venezuela since 2013. I did an episode a couple of weeks ago called The Illusion of Legitimacy. I think that fits right in line with the International Crisis Group framing the premises of legitimacy. That's all there is. It's not real votes determining the future of the world. It is the premise of legitimacy. It is a public mandate that cannot be delivered through fake elections. Because free and fair elections are elections held under the terms of the regime, achieving the regime's desired outcomes. They are psychological operations meant to convince the public that they have given their public mandate to whoever the television says is the winner. This is CNN yesterday. Federal judges declined to extend voter registration deadline in Georgia and Florida as states face hurricane damage. Now, what is the key raw material of the election fraud apparatus? Voter registrations. And from that raw material, they create fake ballots. They send those ballots out. They collect them. They vote them. They count them. And then through a system of lawfare, they protect the reported results. The regime controls every step of that process. 2 federal judges have rejected requests to immediately reopen voter registration in Georgia and Florida as the Southeast continues to grapple with significant storm damage ahead of the November election. Southern states impacted by Hurricane Helene have been facing intense pressure by voting and civil rights groups to give residents more time to register to vote, given the devastation wrought by the storm and the disruption already caused by Hurricane Milton, which made landfall on Florida's western coast late Wednesday. U.S. District Judge Eleanor Ross in Atlanta ruled on Thursday that arguments pushed by the NAACP, Georgia Coalition for the People's Agenda, and the New Georgia Project asking to extend the deadline a week lacked clarity and detail as to how specific individuals were harmed. And how about that? Conservative media is telling us that the Democrat Communist Party is attempting to steal these elections by disenfranchising voters in the hurricane-affected areas of these red states. They're saying these are primarily Republican voters. You're going to need their votes to win this close election. And at that point, we are supposed to get upset and say something must be done. Well, what does the regime want done? Strangely, the NAACP and these other communist, quote unquote, voting rights and civil rights groups are pursuing the solution. They are using the hurricane to open up voter registrations in these states again, much closer to the election, so they can insert any number of names they need to create the ballots, send the ballots, collect the ballots, mark the ballots, count the ballots, and protect the outcomes. in order to substantiate that a real election took place and that real votes were actually counted. Why are the most Trump-hating organizations on the planet trying to, quote unquote, protect the right to vote for all these poor white families in the affected areas? They just care so much about voting rights and civil rights? Well, that's never been true before. They're trying to open up a window to create a flood of new voter registrations. Without an extension, attorneys for the groups wrote in court papers, prospective voters, quote, will be deprived of that fundamental right because of the devastation caused by Hurricane Helene, the threat to safety caused by Hurricane Milton, and the resultant shutdown of all means of voter registration, including government offices, roads, the internet, and the postal service, twice within the last weeks leading up to the voter registration deadline. Once again, the regime is exploiting a humanitarian crisis, not even to win a legitimate election and make sure everyone who could vote and wanted to vote was able to vote. They're doing it so they can more easily substantiate whatever product of a fraudulent vote in a fake election they choose to report as real, all in service of creating the premise of legitimacy in the public perception and creating that necessary public mandate by threatening whoever might disagree with it. We went through the resolution coming out of the West Virginia legislature yesterday that essentially declared there's no way that West Virginia would recognize any claim to the presidency by Kamala Harris. And the resolution ran through a litany of justifications, threats that the regime made against Donald Trump, known aspects of election interference, various forms of manipulation, the assassination attempts, the assassination threats, if any bodily harm were to come to the Republican candidate. And I noted that all of those standards had been met. And not only that, they were met in 2020. Here's a headline in the Washington Post today. Trump requests military aircraft and vehicles amid Iran threat. Donald Trump's campaign requested military aircraft for Trump to fly in during the final weeks of the campaign, expanded flight restrictions over his residence and rallies, ballistic glass pre-positioned in 7 battleground states for the campaign's use, and an array of military vehicles to transport Trump, according to emails reviewed by the Washington Post and people familiar with the matter. The requests are extraordinary and unprecedented. No nominee in recent history has been ferried around in military planes ahead of an election. But the requests came after Trump's campaign advisors received briefings in which the government said Iran is still actively plotting to kill him, according to the emails reviewed by the Post and the people familiar with the matter who spoke on the condition of anonymity to describe sensitive documents. Wow. Trump advisors have grown concerned about drones and missiles, according to the people. In the emails over the past 2 weeks, from campaign manager Susie Wiles to Ronald L. Rowe Jr., the head of the Secret Service, she expressed displeasure with the Secret Service and said the campaign recently had to cancel a public event at the last minute because of a lack of personnel from the Secret Service, instead only putting Trump in a small room with reporters. Wiles said Trump's campaign is being hampered in its planning because of threats and expects to hold far more events in the final weeks of the campaign. She also wrote that the U.S. government has not been able to provide what the campaign views as an extensive enough plan to protect Trump. Representative Michael Waltz of Florida, a Trump ally, also wrote a letter to the Secret Service asking for military aircraft or additional protection for Trump's private plane, according to a copy of the letter reviewed by the Post. Secret Service officials did not answer specific questions about the discussions with the Trump campaign, but spokesman Anthony Guglielmi said in a statement that Trump is receiving, quote, the highest levels of protection, end quote. In a letter to the campaign, Rowe said the government is assessing what can be provided. Assistance from the Department of Defense is regularly provided for the former president's protection, to include explosive ordnance disposal, canine units, and airlift transportation, Guglielmi said. The Secret Service is also imposing temporary flight restrictions, quote, over the former president's residence when he travels, end quote. Additionally, the former president is receiving the highest level of technical security assets, which include unmanned aerial vehicles, counter-unmanned aerial surveillance systems, ballistics, and other advanced technology systems, Guglielmi said. Most of the rest of the article is just the proper contextualization from the perspective of the Washington Post, which means they spend their time seeding different ways that their audience might dismiss this whole thing, thinking that Trump is crazy, the threats are overstated, no evidence, baseless claims, and the rest. And of course, Joe Biden and the Secret Service are doing everything within their power to protect Donald Trump. It's all very boring. What's not boring is Donald Trump requesting military aircraft and other military support as he travels around the country. And will he get it? That's the real question. We might see it this weekend. And if that's the case, that would be hilarious. How is he getting that protection? We're just hearing about the requests for the first time, and we're being told they're already doing everything they could ever need to do. So with that in mind, if Donald Trump gets the additional protection he's requesting, what could explain something like that? I don't know, but we had better explore every single possibility except that Donald Trump is actually the commander-in-chief. I mean, we were told by the global regime that Joe Biden is president. Donald Trump has even referred to Joe Biden as president a couple of times, just like the global regime referred to Juan Guaido as president. And Donald Trump also referred to Juan Guaido as president a couple of times. Gosh, it's all just so difficult to understand. A president can be illegitimate even if the TV says he's legitimate, and even if other governments say that president's legitimate, he still might be illegitimate. Don't we need to grovel before our election officials? And don't we need to grovel before our courts? And don't we need to grovel before our local representatives and state representatives and federal representatives? Don't we need to beg authorities to fix our problems for us? No, we don't. Just one more election-related item here, and we'll return to the question of legitimacy and transitions and multiple presidents, layers of legitimacy and parallel governments. This is Next Gov from Tuesday, October 8th. Foreign adversaries will aim to discredit results after Election Day, intel officials warn. Foreign rivals seeking to tip November's presidential election results in their favor will likely deploy tactics that cast doubt on the election results after November 5th by amplifying false claims and disinformation, intelligence officials warn. The intelligence community, quote, expects foreign influence actors to continue their campaigns by calling into question the validity of the election's results after the polls close. An official in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence told reporters on a Monday call. Thus, in such a contested post-election atmosphere, foreign actors probably will use tactics similar to those that they are using today to undermine trust in the integrity of the election and election processes, as well as to further exacerbate divisions among Americans, said the official who spoke on the condition of anonymity per ground rules of the call. And naturally, we hear these assessments all the time. Just as a brief aside, Trump has been talking this week about the corruption, the malfeasance, the election interference by CBS News. They conducted a terrible debate. We know about the Leslie Stahl 60 Minutes interview back in 2020. 60 Minutes just interviewed Kamala Harris and edited that interview in various segments specifically to make Harris look good. Donald Trump has been going off about all of this on Truth Social and elsewhere and talking about how CBS should lose their license. And maybe that is true according to the rules of the game. And if we want to enforce the rules in that way, so be it. But that's another situation where we don't need to seek authority to solve our problems. We don't need to grovel and beg the government to fix CBS News for us. We just need to turn off CBS News. If everyone turns off CBS News, then CBS News doesn't matter anymore. It is another parallel to what we were talking about. If everyone just turns off Joe Biden as president, the idea, the concept, then it no longer exists. It is no one else's responsibility to discern truth for us. We do not need to beg authorities for help in that effort. And we shouldn't want to empower authorities to determine what is true and false in the first place and then to enforce it. Back to the article. The assessment, delivered just under a month before November 5th, adds that foreign adversaries are expecting the race between former President Donald Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris to be a close call. Foreign nations, namely Russia, Iran, and China, oh no, have already made attempts throughout the past year to meddle in election outcomes and political discourse. The U.S. last month charged Iranian operatives with carrying out hacking activities to disrupt the election, including a breach into the email inboxes of Trump campaign staff. Officials also said that Russia, China, and Cuba are aiming to influence the vote in select congressional races to promote candidates that are more in favor of the nation's geopolitical or economic stances. And it seems like what they're after here is the ability to delegitimize candidates on the congressional level. It won't be enough just to simply delegitimize Trump. You're going to have to delegitimize some of his allies. They were all supported by Russia, Iran, China, and Cuba for some reason. Moscow, for instance, backs candidates opposed to sending more aid to Ukraine, while Beijing is pushing for those that support core interests around its claims to Taiwan. So if you're not interested in going along with the regime's agenda in Ukraine and Taiwan, it's because you're under the influence of these foreign nations and their election interference. It's not because you just simply don't want to spend all of America's blood and treasure protecting regime proxy states that are creations of the regime in the first place. Back to the article. Cuba is focused on top-of-mind political issues, including trade embargoes and travel restrictions. Havana considers election influence activities as part of its standing requirements to influence those policies, and Florida is a prime target of their activities, said the ODNI official, who added that Cuban operatives have focused heavily on the Latino population and Spanish-speaking voters. A different ODNI official said that campaigns have received quote-unquote defensive briefings about the malign influence efforts, but declined to name specifics. The official added that the office has delivered more than, quote, 3 times the number of briefings that we have delivered in prior election cycles. Sounds like a whole lot of malign influence. Now, there is a transcript of this briefing for the press on the State Department's website. And introducing this briefing, the moderator says, "Hello and welcome to the Washington Foreign Press Center's briefing on election security 30 days before Election Day. My name is Gina Staub at the U.S. Department of State, and I'm the moderator for today's briefing. This briefing is on background. On the call today, we have several experts. They will self-identify, and you can attribute their remarks to an ODNI official." And that, of course, is the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. So the media members on this briefing call knew who these officials were, but couldn't report their names to the public. Why would they need anonymity for these sorts of claims? It's almost like they're just making it all up and don't want it attributed back to them. And there's one quote from the briefing I want to share with you. "The U.S. intelligence community does not evaluate the effectiveness of foreign intelligence operations because doing so would require us to evaluate protected free speech in the United States." And so this is one of the officials speaking to the media members on the call. "So that is not a role for the intelligence community. As far as the safety of voting systems and procedures, what I would say there is we have not seen foreign efforts to date to attack the integrity of voting systems. A lot of the activity we're seeing so far is influence operations or information operations, and some of those operations do question the integrity of the voting if that distinction is clear. And so they're saying the foreign influence operations are attacking everything but the actual election system. The actual election system is perfect, you see. If you doubt that, you're repeating the big lie, you're telling a conspiracy theory, and you're threatening to tear at the very fabric of our democracy. You see, what they're actually trying to do is they're trying to trick the American people, particularly those people who might be open to voting for Donald Trump and all of these other candidates. You know, all those stupid people. These foreign influence operations work like a charm against those stupid people. And when we tell you that Donald Trump or any of these candidates won based on malign foreign influence, you'll know it's because they were stupid and not because the election system was intentionally created to guarantee the ability to substantiate the reported outcomes of fake elections. Perhaps someday we'll recognize this trick and stop supporting that system in the first place. We think that we give our votes and they tell us what we voted for. That's not how it works. They tell us what we voted for, and then if we are able to check in a probing enough manner, they create the evidence to substantiate the reported results. Because it's not really possible in most cases to prove the illegitimacy or unlawfulness of the individual votes. That's why they set the system up this way. And so let's get back to matters of transitions and illegitimacy and parallel governments. This is from Axios yesterday. Some top Dems won't commit to certifying a Trump win. Isn't that remarkable? It sounds like the media is telling us that members of the Uniparty are refusing to accept the results of our elections, even though we're told that our elections are free and fair, safe and secure, and that the reported results accurately reflect the will and intent of the American voters. How is it possible? Are they threatening our democracy? No, because it's not our democracy. We're talking about the parallel system that they have layered on top of our actual system. And in that false reality, they are not threatening to tear America apart. They are preserving America. And they expect you to go along with it because your idea of America is formed within their false reality, and that is what they rely on. As soon as you stop complying with their projection of what America and America's government actually are, it simply vanishes. House Democrats railed against House Speaker Mike Johnson for hedging on whether a GOP-controlled House would certify a Kamala Harris victory. But some of their senior members are playing a similar game. Those Democrats are trapped between their deep distrust of Donald Trump and their vigorous denunciations of any election challenges in the years since the January 6th attack. Democrat leaders, however, seem fully prepared to certify a Trump victory, making potential dissenters a small minority. Raskin, the House Oversight Committee ranking member and former J6 committee member who objected to Trump electors in 2017, told Axios in an interview that if Trump, quote, won a free, fair, and honest election, then we would obviously accept it, end quote. However, Raskin said he definitely doesn't assume that Trump would use free, fair, and honest means to secure a victory. Trump, Raskin says, is doing whatever he can to try to interfere with the process, whether we're talking about manipulating electoral college counts in Nebraska or manipulating the vote count in Georgia or imposing other kinds of impediments. Neither of those two examples Jamie Raskin just gave are Donald Trump's doing, nor is there anything untoward about them. He's mad that Georgia's state elections board wants the ballots counted. Representative Jan Schakowsky of Illinois, a senior chief deputy whip, who voted to object to George W. Bush electors in 2005, said of Trump, "I don't know what kind of shenanigans he is planning," adding, "We would have to, in any election, make sure that all the rules have been followed." Oh yeah, just like 2020. But of course they weren't followed. And everyone who brought that up was framed as a domestic terrorist. Schakowsky later said in a statement that she was, quote, proud to join all my Democrat colleagues in certifying the 2020 election, and that she looks forward to, quote, doing the same in January 2025. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries, who wields huge influence over his members, has signaled there is little chance of an organized effort to decertify electors. House Democrats are going to do everything necessary to ensure that the winner of the presidential election is certified on January 6th without drama or consequences, Jeffries said at a September press conference. House Administration Committee ranking member Joe Morell of New York, Jeffries' top deputy on election administration issues, has made similar statements. The two parties have very different histories when it comes to election objections, with Democrats lodging doomed, symbolic challenges as part of largely uneventful proceedings. In 2005, Democrats' objection to Bush's win in Ohio failed 31 to 267 in the House and 1 to 74 in the Senate. In 2017, half a dozen Democrats filed objections to 10 Trump elector slates, but failed to get the backing of a senator and were unable to force any votes. In 2021, a majority of House Republicans voted to object to President Biden's wins in Arizona and Pennsylvania. It was part of a sprawling effort to overturn the 2020 election that culminated in the deadly attack on January 6th. So objecting to an obviously fraudulent election in two states where those state legislatures agreed caused January 6th, but repeated objections to certified electors by Democrats failed and were largely uneventful afterward, and therefore are just a legitimate part of this process. Everything within their system is legitimate on their terms because they create the terms for legitimacy within their system. Everything outside of their system is illegitimate because, again, they create the standards for legitimacy. Who gave them that right? Who gave them that responsibility? Who even gave them the opportunity? You didn't. I didn't. It is a charade. It is a falsehood layered on top of what our country is actually supposed to be. Did they follow their own stated standards of legitimacy? No, they did not. They simply recognized their guy, and they enforced the premise of legitimacy through their control of media and finance, with the threat of overwhelming force just behind it. And they used that force against individual American people in order to show the rest what would happen to them if they stepped out of line. And of course, that notion was all enforced through media manipulation and financial manipulation. Back to Axios. Argued Raskin, Democrats don't engage in election fraud and election fabrication. Very bold, commie, very bold. Trump and his loyalists are already laying the groundwork to deny Harris a victory, including filing over 100 lawsuits challenging election procedures. Democrats, for their part, may challenge a Trump win in court, but likely wouldn't take that fight all the way to Congress, said former January 6th committee chair Benny Thompson. And again, the entire point is that they are seeking public mandate, so they can't then go do things that would threaten the potential for public mandate. Thompson argued there are enough provisions in law so that voters who feel aggrieved in their loss can take it to court. The bottom line, according to Axios, I expect we would do as we did in 2016, Representative Dan Kildee of Michigan, a member of Jeffries' leadership team, told Axios. While disappointed with the outcome of the election, and despite a handful of outliers making a statement, we did not object then, nor would we now object to the result of a Democratic election. And I guess we shall see. Raskin has offered a variety of potential objections and potential strategies they might pursue in the event the television tells us that Donald Trump has won. Those may even be better options for them, particularly if they can work to disqualify Donald Trump from the presidency using, of course, that Reconstruction Amendment, the 14th Amendment. The secretaries of state in the individual states tried to remove Trump from the ballot under the 14th Amendment, claiming that he incited an insurrection using the sham J6 committee report based on a white paper by Norm Eisen as the proof that Trump had committed insurrection, something that the president simply cannot do. But the Supreme Court said they couldn't. The Supreme Court said that sort of thing has to be initiated in Congress. Congress is the only body that could declare that the president incited an insurrection and was an insurrectionist. And Raskin has said before that he intends to pursue that strategy. And of course, that strategy itself only exists in that false reality layer. Is anyone going to approve of that strategy being carried out and carried through? The only chance of that being possible, in my mind, is if there is a parallel uniparty right effort to delegitimize Trump's victory after 11/5, knowing that if they assist the uniparty left in removing Trump, then they get to have one of their guys there and begin the work of rebuilding their power and reputation. And they assume that MAGA will go right along with them because they believe that they have convinced us by being sometimes Trump, as Ben Shapiro says, that they are our allies and we will go ahead and support their guy. Well, who's their guy going to be? I guess we'll find out if we have to. Why would we have to? Well, the only reason we'd have to is if people want to continue getting the hose over and over and over again. If people don't want to get the hose, they can simply recognize the real dynamic at play here and simply opt out. We need to move to the parallel system. And the parallel system isn't something new and scary. It's the real system. We just need to eliminate that layer of falsehood. And that sort of thing can be done quickly if absolutely everybody realizes it must be done, and no one will stand for any delays in that process. There is no need to seek the help of higher authorities. It's something we do in our minds and can enforce in our voices. And when we do that, we will experience the smooth transition to a second Trump administration that has already happened. I'll be back on Monday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic. And Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening for free and would like to support the show, the best way to do that is by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can find the info stream over on Telegram at t.me/veryreasonable. The merch site is cancelcouture.com. And for all my other links, you can visit linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon. Down on the range.